His younger son Daniel, a pilot, called with a voice that shook and whispered a nightmare no father could believe. He said his sister-in-law was at the house. Calmly, the father replied she was upstairs in the shower. Then Daniel's words cut like a knife that was impossible. Her passport was in his hand. She had just boarded his flight to France. And then footsteps creaked on the stairs, and her voice floated down sweet and ordinary. "I'm glad you're home. What would you do if the same woman was in 2 places at once? Comment with your city, or just a number, and don't forget to subscribe for what comes next." The morning had unfolded with a deceptive calm that felt almost staged, as if life itself had pressed pause before unleashing chaos. He stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up, warm water rushing over porcelain plates slick with soap. The scrape of the sponge against ceramic was the only sound filling the kitchen, steady, mindless, and ordinary. Outside the window, the Arizona sun filtered through pale curtains, throwing soft stripes of gold across the countertop. It was the kind of morning that carried no warning, no tremor of the storm that was already circling overhead. Richard, his eldest, had left early. The slam of the front door hours ago still echoed faintly in his memory, leaving behind the usual silence of a house occupied only by ghosts of routine. Richard's footsteps, once the confident march of a boy late for school, now belonged to a man burdened with deadlines and blueprints. His absence was familiar, expected, and never questioned. Michael, the grandson, had already been scooped up by the school bus. The father remembered the boy's quick hug, the innocent scent of pencil shavings and cereal clinging to his sweater, the high-pitched call of "see you later." Grandpa, that lingered even after the bus's brakes hissed and the wheels carried him down the street. A 7-year-old's world was simple drawings, teacher's recess, but that very simplicity made the contrast with what was to come unbearably sharp. And then there was Elena. She had called down softly, her voice lilting like warm honey, saying she was headed to take a shower. Her presence in the house had always been marked by small sounds. A door creaking, her shoes clicking against the hardwood, her laughter carrying faintly from upstairs. He had answered her with a nod, barely looking up from the suds, the exchange so ordinary that it slipped into the rhythm of the morning unnoticed. The hum of running water soon followed, faint through the ceiling, steady and constant, grounding the illusion that everything was exactly as it should be. The father wiped his hands on a worn kitchen towel, folded it carefully over the oven handle, and let himself breathe in the quiet. This was the kind of silence he had grown used to since his wife had passed, a silence not filled with loneliness, but with routine. The small domestic rituals gave shape to his days. Soap bubbles clung to the rim of the sink, shimmering briefly before collapsing. He watched one dissolve, felt the sting of regret press against his chest, and reminded himself that life had to keep moving forward. He moved into the living room, the floorboards creaking under his weight, and sank into the armchair by the window. A newspaper lay folded on the side table, unread headlines staring back at him with bold indifference. He picked it up, adjusted his glasses, but the words blurred. His mind was elsewhere, wandering through memories of family dinners when both his sons were still under one roof before work, and marriages scattered them into different worlds. He thought of Richard as a boy with scraped knees, of Daniel's fascination with the sky, how the child would stand in the yard pointing at planes as if they were promises waiting to be kept. Upstairs the water still ran. He listened to it for a moment, steady, reliable. Elena was there, her presence so ordinary it was almost invisible. He trusted the sound of that water, the thrum of plumbing through old pipes, as if it were proof of her existence in the house. It anchored him in normalcy, lulled him into believing there was nothing to question, nothing to fear. He walked to the family photographs arranged neatly along the wall, dusted frames catching light. There was Richard on his wedding day, awkward smile under a rented tuxedo. There was Daniel in his crisp pilot's uniform, proud grin, betraying the nerves of his first flight. There was little Michael swaddled in a blanket, his tiny fist clenched, as if he were already ready to fight the world. And then Elena, bright eyes, immaculate hair, her smile fixed in the confidence of someone who had mastered appearances. He looked at her face for a long time, longer than he intended, the water still rushing above his head, each drop suddenly heavy with meaning he couldn't yet understand. The clock ticked on the wall, sharp and insistent. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee gone cold. The day had the stillness of a stage set, everything in its place, waiting for the curtain to rise. He adjusted his watch, rubbed his palms together, and told himself it was just another day. Just another morning of chores and silence and waiting for the evening when the house would be full again. But there was something beneath the surface, a tension he could not name, a subtle crack in the glass of reality. He felt it in the way his breath caught when the phone rang, slicing through the silence like a blade. He felt it in the way his hand hesitated over the receiver, as if he already knew that answering would change everything. He picked it up, expecting the familiar cadence of Daniel's voice, offering nothing more than a cheerful hello. But even before his son spoke, the air shifted, charged alive with a truth that would rip the ordinary morning apart. That voice, trembling heavy with disbelief, would not simply ask about his father's day. It would plant the seed of terror, of suspicion, of betrayal. And in that moment, with soap still clinging to his skin, and the sound of water still running upstairs, he would realize that ordinary mornings could be the cruelest lies of all. The quiet before the storm had already ended, and he had not even noticed the first raindrop. The morning's calm would never return, and what came next would force him to question not just his daughter-in-law, but every memory, every detail, every certainty he had built his family upon. The voice on the other end carried a warmth that wrapped around the father like a blanket against a sudden chill. Daniel always had that gift. Even from thousands of feet in the air, the younger son could make his father feel as though he was sitting right across the kitchen table. His laugh came through the receiver, low and easy, the same laugh that had filled their yard when he was a boy chasing paper airplanes across the grass. For a fleeting moment, the father felt his chest loosen the tension of widowhood, and aging momentarily softened by the sound of his son's life taking flight. Daniel had become everything his father once dared to dream, but never could reach. A pilot, a man trusted with wings soaring between cities and continents, while the rest of the world crawled on asphalt. The father often thought back to the summer nights they'd spent on the roof of the old truck, pointing at blinking red lights tracing the sky. Daniel had said, then barely 10 years old, that one day he wouldn't just watch the planes, he'd command them. Now, every time the phone rang and that confident voice spilled into his ear, the father was reminded that dreams didn't always die in childhood. Some of them became real, and this one had become his son. The conversation began the way it always did. A gentle check-in, a story from the cockpit, the easy rhythm of banter that smoothed over the miles. Daniel spoke about the sunrise he had watched unfold at 30,000 feet, how the horizon turned molten gold and bled into blue, a view that made the cramped cabin and endless hours worthwhile. The father listened with pride swelling in his chest, picturing his son, framed by glass and sky hands, steady on the controls, carrying lives across oceans. He didn't say it aloud. Men of his generation rarely did. But every word Daniel spoke was a reminder that he had raised something greater than himself. There was comfort in the way Daniel lingered on small details. The cup of strong coffee balanced in the cockpit, the co-pilot who hummed Sinatra tunes through turbulence, the way passengers looked out of the window with awe when clouds parted. It was life in motion, vibrant and young, everything the father had once been before. Time settled him into routines of bills, mortgages, and loss. Hearing Daniel speak was like hearing proof that sacrifice meant something, that the double shifts and long nights had built a runway his son now soared from. For a moment he allowed himself to close his eyes and just listen. The house around him was still Elena's shower, still drumming faintly above, but in his mind he was thousands of feet in the air, riding alongside his son. He could almost see Daniel's grin as he described the sensation of lifting off the thrum in the bones as wheels left the ground. That sound in his voice, the blend of awe and control, was enough to make the father's throat tighten. Pride was a dangerous thing, heavy and sharp, but in that instant it filled him without apology. But pride was not the only emotion threaded through the call. There was also relief, the kind that came from knowing Daniel still reached for him, despite the years, despite the distance. After his wife's death, he had feared his family would scatter like leaves in wind. Richard was present, dutiful in his own way, but busy with blueprints and deadlines. Daniel called not out of obligation but out of instinct, like a son who understood that a father alone in a house too quiet sometimes needed to hear life beyond its walls. The father chuckled when Daniel made a joke about turbulence rattling a woman's wig loose mid-flight, and for a heartbeat laughter connected them like old times. The kind of laughter that carried echoes of baseball games, backyard barbecues, and road trips with the windows down. It was easy to forget the weight pressing on his shoulders, the loneliness waiting in every shadow. For a moment the house felt less like a tomb of memories, and more like a place where family still existed, still breathed. And yet beneath the laughter something flickered in Daniel's tone, barely noticeable but sharp enough to catch. A hesitation. The father leaned forward in his chair, hand gripping the receiver tighter. Years of raising two boys had taught him to hear the things unsaid, to sense the shift in energy before the words formed. Daniel's laughter tapered off, replaced by a silence, too deliberate a pause stretched long enough to turn warmth into unease. The father sat straighter, his back stiffening. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the faint hum of water from the shower above no longer comforting but ominous. His son cleared his throat once-twice like a man about to say something that would fracture the illusion of normalcy. The father held his breath, waiting the warmth of connection cooling into the first sting of dread. It was in that silence, in that fragile suspension between ordinary conversation and whatever came next, that the father realized the morning had been nothing but a stage set for revelation. The soap bubbles, the newspaper, the soft voice upstairs, they were props in a play about to collapse. He could feel it pressing in on him, the truth Daniel was about to spill. And when his son finally spoke, the father would wish he had never answered the phone at all. The warmth in Daniel's voice vanished so abruptly, it was as if another man had taken the line. A pause stretched thin, followed by a sharp inhale, and then words came brittle and uncertain. He didn't sound like the confident pilot describing the sunrise from the cockpit anymore. He sounded like a man staring at something he could not make sense of. His father sat rigid in the chair, pressing the receiver hard against his ear, as though the pressure alone could force the words to make sense. Daniel's voice dropped lower, cautious, as though he feared being overheard. He said he was staring at Elena. Not a look-alike, not someone who resembled her, but Elena herself, seated in first class only a few rows from the cockpit door. She wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit leaned close to her, their conversation intimate, their body language unmistakable. Daniel described the tilt of her head, the curve of her smile, the casual way her hand rested on the man's wrist as though it belonged there. The father shook his head violently, eyes darting to the ceiling where water still throbbed through the pipes. He wanted to tell Daniel to stop, that it was impossible, that he had just spoken to her moments ago. But his son's voice carried a weight that crushed protest before it could form. Daniel was not joking. He was not mistaken. His tone had the precision of a man accustomed to detail, to identifying threats at 30,000 feet, to distinguishing between clouds and storms, between what was real and what was deadly. And in that steady, grim cadence, Daniel insisted again she was on his flight. The father's throat went dry. He glanced at the hallway where shadows stretched long against the walls. The murmur of water upstairs was suddenly too loud, too mechanical, as if mocking him. He tried to conjure explanations. A cruel prank, a misunderstanding, maybe even a twin he didn't know about. His mind clawed for reason, but each possibility collapsed under the gravity of Daniel's conviction. He pressed his free hand against his temple, felt the throb of blood pounding behind his eyes. Daniel gave details no stranger could invent. The way Elena always tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was nervous. The small scar near her collarbone from a childhood accident. Even the perfume she wore, faint but unmistakable in the recycled air of the cabin. Every detail was a nail sealing the coffin of denial. The father muttered something incoherent, a plea or perhaps a protest, but Daniel cut him off. He said he held her passport in his hand. He had checked it himself. The picture, the name, the date of birth, it was Elena's. There was no doubt, no margin of error. The father felt his grip tighten around the receiver until his knuckles whitened. Upstairs the pipes groaned, the sound of rushing water still steady. but what once had been proof of her presence now felt like the sound of a lie echoing through the house. The living room dimmed, though the sun still shone outside. It was as if the world had bent slightly, tilting reality into something fragile and dangerous. He thought of Michael innocent and trusting, gone to school with no idea of the storm brewing inside his family. He thought of Richard already buried in his work, oblivious to the crack tearing through the foundation of their home. And he thought of himself standing at the center of it all, trapped between two truths that could not coexist. He opened his mouth to tell Daniel he must be wrong, but the words clung to his throat heavy and sour, because deep down a sliver of doubt had already taken root. He remembered Elena's sudden trips to the market, the unexplained phone calls she dismissed with a smile, the way she sometimes lingered by the mirror as if rehearsing another life. He had ignored these things, choosing instead to cling to the comfort of routine. Now they returned like ghosts demanding attention. Daniel's voice sharpened, stripped of hesitation. He said he didn't know what was happening, but he needed his father to be careful. That single word, careful, sent a shiver crawling down the father's spine. He turned his head slowly toward the staircase, every creak of the house suddenly amplified. The air smelled faintly of Elena's perfume, a sweetness that had once felt ordinary, but now carried menace. The father whispered his thanks, voice cracked and thin, and Daniel's response was quick, firm, a promise that he would call again once the plane landed. The line went dead, leaving the father in a silence that screamed. He set the phone down slowly, as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile thread of reality. The house no longer felt like his own. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound exaggerated, every familiar object suddenly alien. He stood, legs unsteady, and moved to the base of the stairs. Water still roared above. He gripped the banister, his palms slick with sweat, and listened. The ordinary had turned into theater, the shower into a curtain concealing something sinister. For the first time in his life he wondered if he was losing his mind, if grief and loneliness had twisted his perception until nothing could be trusted. But then he remembered Daniel's voice, steady, unshaken, deadly serious, and he knew the madness wasn't his. The father stayed there, frozen at the foot of the stairs, torn between climbing up to confront what waited behind the bathroom door or walking out into the daylight to escape it. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a countdown. Somewhere between those two choices lay the truth, and the truth would either shatter him or set him free. He closed his eyes, inhaled once, and took the first step upward, every nerve in his body screaming. And in that moment he realized that ordinary mornings could collapse into nightmares in less than a breath, and that the next sound he heard from above would decide which world he was living in. The water upstairs pounded through the pipes like a steady drumbeat, a rhythm that should have meant safety but now struck his ears like a warning. Steam drifted faintly down the stairwell, carrying the scent of lavender soap, a detail so ordinary it felt unreal. He could still hear Elena's voice in his mind, soft and casual, telling him she was going to take a shower. It had been minutes ago, no more. That voice still clung to the walls. And yet Daniel's words echoed harder, stripping the air of comfort. His son had her passport, her face, her name, her seat assignment, all confirmed. She was flying across the Atlantic with another man. The contradiction was so sharp it split his reality down the middle. He gripped the banister at the foot of the stairs, sweat slicking his palm, heart hammering as if he'd just run miles instead of standing still. Each creak of the house amplified the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the tick of the clock, the relentless rush of water. It all pressed against him, a weight of ordinary sounds turned sinister by doubt. He thought about walking upstairs, pushing open the bathroom door, demanding proof of who stood behind the curtain. But fear rooted him. What if he opened it and found nothing? Or worse, what if he found her smiling at him, towel around her shoulders, while his son watched her glide through an airplane aisle halfway across the world? His knees weakened. He sank onto the bottom step, elbows on his thighs, fingers clawing at his scalp. The house felt hostile now, filled with eyes he couldn't see, truths he couldn't touch. He muttered to himself fragments of disbelief, broken phrases like prayers. Daniel wouldn't lie. His son had no reason to fabricate something this absurd, this cruel. But the shower roared louder, as if mocking him with its persistence. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound burrowed through relentless until his own heartbeat seemed to sync with the pounding water. Images tore through his mind like film reels spliced together. Elena sitting at his breakfast table smiling politely, thanking him for the coffee. Elena laughing with Michael tucking the boy's jacket as he rushed out to catch the bus. Elena moving upstairs, her perfume trailing faintly in the hall. Then another Elena painted by Daniel's words, lounging in first class, a glass of wine in her manicured hand, her body angled toward a stranger in a tailored suit. Both versions existed at once, layered over each other, until he no longer knew which was real. He rose again, unable to stay still. His feet carried him into the living room where the photographs lined the walls like witnesses. Elena's face smiled from one frame, her wedding day glow forever captured in glass. He stared at the picture until his eyes blurred. Did she look like the woman on Daniel's flight, or was she only a mask he had never questioned? His stomach twisted violently, bile rising. He stumbled to the kitchen sink and splashed water on his face, but even the cold shock couldn't steady him. The phone on the counter buzzed once. His chest clenched, desperate for Daniel's voice again. But it was only a message alert from the electric company, dull and meaningless. He slammed the phone down, rage and terror boiling together. His pulse throbbed at his temples. He couldn't hold both truths much longer, the woman upstairs and the woman on the plane. Something had to give. He found himself standing in front of the staircase again, staring up into the haze of steam. He tried to steady his breathing, told himself he would climb, confront, settle this nightmare. His foot lifted onto the first step. The wood groaned under his weight. Then a sound froze him. The shower cut off. Silence cascaded down, heavy and absolute. He stood motionless, holding his breath, straining for the next sound. The scrape of a curtain rod, a soft thud of a bottle placed on tile, then footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching the door. Every muscle in his body coiled tight. His mouth went dry. He imagined the door opening, Elena emerging, smiling with wet hair and damp skin as if nothing were wrong. But in his mind he also saw her seated on that plane, leaning into another man's shoulder. Both visions collided, splintering his thoughts. He clutched the banister until his knuckles turned white, waiting for the knob to turn. The door opened. Steam spilled into the hallway, rolling down the stairs like smoke from a fire. And then she spoke, her voice calm, casual, the same tone she had used minutes earlier. She asked if he needed anything from the market, as though the world hadn't tilted on its axis. The sound sliced through him, colder than silence. He forced his lips into something that resembled a smile, though inside his chest a storm howled. His voice cracked as he muttered something about tomatoes, words that tasted like metal on his tongue. She nodded, wrapped in her robe, and drifted down the hall without suspicion. He remained at the base of the stairs. Breath, uneven pulse. Wild, every fiber of him stretched between two impossible realities. The contradiction had not resolved. It had only deepened. And as the front door clicked shut behind her, leaving him alone in the house again, he realized the most terrifying part was not the impossibility itself, but the fact that he no longer trusted his own eyes, his own mind. And in that moment, as he stared at the door she had passed through, a single thought lodged deep in his chest. If she could be in two places at once, then he had no idea who or what was truly sharing his house. His hands shook so violently, the phone almost slipped from his grip, slick with sweat, though the room itself was cool. His chest constricted, ribs grinding against a weight that didn't belong there, as if stones had been stacked inside him one by one. The living room, once bathed in bright Arizona sunlight, seemed to close in walls, pressing tighter with every breath. He felt the ceiling lowering, the windows narrowing, the air thinning until each inhale scraped raw in his throat. Fear had never felt so physical. It wasn't just in his mind, it was in his body now, crawling under his skin, burrowing deep into the marrow. He staggered toward the armchair by the window, the familiar leather creaking under him. But even the comfort of its worn shape couldn't hold him steady. His leg bounced uncontrollably, his fingers tapping the armrest like a Morse code of panic. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, but the noise only intensified the ringing in his ears, a high-pitched hum that drowned everything else. He rubbed at his sternum as though he could push the weight away, but it clung tighter, squeezing, daring him to break. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something solid, something to anchor him, but every object betrayed him. The family photos blurred the faces of his sons, morphing into strangers. The clock on the wall seemed louder, its ticking not steady but accusatory, reminding him of time slipping away. Even the rug under his feet with its familiar pattern felt foreign, too bright, too sharp, a mockery of normal life. He pressed his palms into his thighs, willing them to stop shaking, but the tremor refused to leave. He whispered Daniel's name under his breath, a desperate attempt to ground himself in the reality of his son's voice, but even that memory felt slippery. His body reacted as though he were standing at the edge of a cliff with no railing, the wind howling, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. His heart slammed against his ribs faster, harder, like it wanted out. He tried to slow his breathing, counting to 4 the way his late wife used to remind him during anxious nights, but the rhythm fell apart after 2. The dread had no interest in control. The sunlight shifted, slipping across the floorboards, and the brightness burned his eyes instead of soothing them. He drew the curtains halfway, but the room only grew darker. The contrast between light and shadow jagged and unsettling. The suffocation deepened. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, though a chill rippled through his arms, raising goosebumps. It felt like 2 climates battled inside him, heat boiling from his chest and cold seeping into his bones. He stood suddenly unable to sit still and paced the room. Each step felt unsteady, as if the floor might tilt. He ran his fingers along the edge of the bookshelf, needing the solidity of wood beneath his skin, but even that felt wrong, too smooth, too staged. He muttered curses under his breath, half at himself for believing the impossible, half at the house for betraying him with its familiarity. His hands itched for something to do, but all he could manage was clenching and unclenching fists, the knuckles pale, the veins sharp against his skin. He caught his reflection in the darkened television screen. The man staring back at him looked older than he remembered, face pale, jaw tight, eyes wide with something primal. Fear carved lines deeper than years ever could. He stepped closer to the screen, gripping its frame, studying the quiver in his mouth, the way his chest rose in shallow bursts. He hated that face. It was not the face of a father in control. It was the face of a man unraveling. The silence broke with the faint slam of a door upstairs. He flinched so hard the phone clattered to the floor. He bent quickly to snatch it up, his fingers slipping twice before he secured it in his grasp. His breath came fast, ragged. Every sound amplified: the hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the pipes, even the shuffle of his own socks against the hardwood. Each noise felt like a threat. He pressed his back to the wall, kneading the cold solidity against him, as if the plaster itself might hold him upright. His body pulsed with adrenaline, hands tingling, lips dry. The thought that Elena might appear in the doorway, dripping from the shower with that calm, unbothered expression, twisted his stomach. Because if she did, it would not soothe him. It would terrify him more. Proof of her presence didn't erase Daniel's voice. It sharpened the contradiction until it drew blood. The father closed his eyes, pressing his palm over them, trying to block out the room, but darkness only made it worse. Images flickered behind his eyelids. Elena's smile across a first-class seat. Elena's shadow on the staircase. Elena's perfume curling through the hall. 2. Elena's impossible, irreconcilable, both demanding belief. His chest constricted tighter, forcing him to gasp, and when his eyes snapped open, the room swam in dizzy shapes. He staggered back toward the armchair, collapsing into it with a force that rattled his bones. His hands clutched the armrests, veins bulging, breath shallow. He sat like that for what felt like hours, though the clock insisted it was only minutes. Time betrayed him. His body betrayed him. His own mind threatened mutiny. He had never been more aware of the fragility of flesh, of how fear could strangle a man without ever laying a hand on him. And yet beneath the crushing dread, another feeling stirred, faint but growing. Anger. Not the sharp, explosive kind, but something colder, buried deep, the kind that waits. He recognized it by the way his jaw clenched, by the flicker in his gut that whispered he could not stay paralyzed forever. Fear had taken root in his body, but fear was fuel too. He inhaled, once shaky but deliberate, and opened his eyes. The house still surrounded him with its suffocating quiet, but something had shifted inside. The trembling remained, the chest still tight, but now a thought pressed harder than panic. He would have to act. He would have to uncover which truth was real, even if it meant tearing apart the fragile fabric of his world. And as footsteps stirred faintly above, moving closer, he realized he would not be given much more time to decide. She appeared at the top of the staircase with a towel wrapped around her hair, a robe cinched neatly at her waist, and the faint scent of lavender soap trailing down the hall before her. Steam still clung to her skin, curling off her damp hair like smoke from a candle just extinguished. She moved with the casual ease of someone at home, utterly unaware of the fracture widening inside the man who watched from below. Elena descended slowly, her steps light, her smile soft, and when she reached the bottom, her voice came gentle, almost affectionate, as she asked if he needed anything from the market. The sweetness in her tone felt like a blade pressed against his throat. He forced himself to nod, to shape his mouth into something resembling a smile, but Daniel's words pounded inside his skull like a drum. "She's on my flight to France. I'm holding her passport. She's sitting next to a wealthy man." The contradiction screamed so loudly it made the silence between Elena's words unbearable. He muttered something about tomatoes, his voice ragged and foreign to his own ears. She didn't notice. She adjusted the robe at her waist, gave a small nod, and slipped on a pair of flats, waiting by the door. The front door opened with a creak, the hinges groaning like old bones, and then it shut softly behind her. He was alone again, left with nothing but the fading perfume of soap and roses, and the echo of her question still hanging in the air. For a long moment he didn't move. His hands were clenched so tightly his nails bit crescents into his palms. He loosened them only when he realized they were trembling again. The house was still. Too still. Normalcy had returned, but instead of calming him, it felt like an elaborate mask hiding something sinister. He moved through the rooms with restless steps, touching objects that had once grounded him. Richard's old baseball glove on a shelf, a framed photo of Michael holding his first fishing pole, even the porcelain dish his wife had bought at a flea market decades ago. They had always been proof of family, of stability, of belonging. Now they looked staged, like props arranged to trick him into believing the world hadn't split in two. He could still hear Elena's cheerful tone as clearly as Daniel's urgent whisper. The two voices overlapped, warring in his mind until neither sounded real. In the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator grew louder, filling the silence with a mechanical growl that grated against his nerves. He reached for a glass of water, but spilled half of it across the counter. His hand wasn't steady enough to hold it. He cursed under his breath, grabbed a towel, and wiped the surface dry. The small domestic act should have calmed him, but it only sharpened his awareness of how fragile his composure had become. A man reduced to trembling over water, while the foundations of his life buckled beneath him. He sat again in his chair by the window, staring at the street where Elena's car had just disappeared. Neighbors walked dogs. Children cycled past. A delivery driver dropped off a package 2 houses down. The world outside moved with careless normality, blind to the storm inside his chest. He envied them for a moment, envied their ignorance, their unbroken realities. He wanted to stand open the window and shout the truth that was eating him alive. But what truth would he even tell? That his daughter-in-law was both upstairs in his house and across the ocean at the same time? No one would believe him. He barely believed himself. The minutes dragged into an hour, maybe longer, though he lost track. Shadows shifted across the living room floor, stretching longer as the sun moved west. He tried reading the paper but couldn't make it past a single headline. He tried turning on the television but muted it seconds later, unable to stomach the chatter of morning talk shows. Every distraction collapsed under the weight of Daniel's voice echoing in his mind. He replayed the call again and again, each word etched deeper until it burned. She's on my flight. First class. Her passport is in my hand. He remembered the way Daniel's tone shifted, how it had stripped away laughter and left only alarm. His son hadn't been confused. He hadn't been mistaken. He had been deadly certain. And that certainty had cut straight through him. The father leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. Sweat dripped from his brow, staining the newspaper crumpled on the table. He thought of his late wife, how she would have handled this moment. She wouldn't have sat paralyzed. She would have demanded answers. She would have stormed into the bathroom, ripped back the curtain, stared the truth in the face, no matter how terrifying it was. She never feared confrontation. He had always admired that in her. And now he hated himself for not having the same steel. He rose abruptly, heart pounding, and began pacing again. He told himself he would confront Elena the moment she returned. He would demand to see her ID, demand an explanation. But then another thought crawled in. What if she had one ready? What if she looked him dead in the eye and gave a lie so smooth it silenced every doubt? Worse, what if she smiled at him the way she always did, with that practiced warmth, and convinced him to question his own sanity? He stopped at the bottom of the staircase and stared up into the shadows of the hall. He thought about the sound of the shower running, the creak of the door, the steam spilling down. All of it had seemed real, felt real. But what if it wasn't? What if he had only wanted it to be real because the alternative was too monstrous to face? A car passed outside, its headlights flashing briefly across the walls. The streak of light illuminated the photo of his sons on the mantel. Daniel's uniformed grin seemed to mock him now, as though the younger son knew the truth while he remained blind inside his own home. The father's stomach knotted tighter, bile rising. He pressed his hand against the wall, steadying himself as the room tilted slightly, though the house itself was still. The front door rattled. He froze, breath caught in his throat. The knob turned slowly, deliberately, and the sound sliced through the silence. His heart hammered. The door swung open and Elena stepped inside, grocery bags in her arms, smiling faintly as if nothing in the world had shifted. And in that instant, as her keys jingled and the paper bag rustled against her hip, he knew he couldn't keep balancing between two realities much longer. One truth had to shatter. The only question left was which one it would be. He watched her gather her basket with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done it countless times before. She slipped her shoes on, adjusted the strap of her purse, and gave him that practiced little smile, as if the world were untouched, as if the house were safe, as if nothing inside him was cracking apart. He forced the corners of his mouth upward, a smile stiff as stone, and whispered that he needed tomatoes. The word caught in his throat, rasped out dry and brittle, but it was enough. She nodded unbothered and walked out into the afternoon light. The door closed softly behind her, leaving him stranded in silence that felt heavier than thunder. He stood there for a moment, rooted in place, his body still, his mind spiraling. He replayed the sound of her voice, the rhythm of her footsteps, the casual tilt of her head. Every detail clashed violently with Daniel's words, each memory a hammer against the fragile wall of denial he had built. His son had sounded certain, his voice clear and urgent, but Elena's presence had felt equally undeniable. The contradiction tore through him, a storm with no center, leaving him gasping for air. He moved to the table and sank into a chair, pressing his palms flat against the surface, as though he could anchor himself there. The wood was cool beneath his skin, steady, real. Yet inside, nothing felt solid. Doubt uncoiled in his chest like a snake, coiling tighter with every breath. He wanted to dismiss it, to cling to the normalcy of her routine, but the certainty in Daniel's voice replayed louder each time he tried. He rubbed his temples, eyes shut, willing himself to believe that one truth could cancel the other, but no peace came. His mind drifted back to the years when he had first welcomed her into the family. He remembered her laughter at the dinner table, how it had seemed genuine, then how it had soothed him after his wife's passing. He remembered the way she had helped Michael with his homework, patient and attentive. He had convinced himself she was a blessing, a thread holding them together. but now every memory bent and warped, the edges curling with suspicion. Were those laughs too polished? Was that patience a mask? He hated himself for asking these questions, but they rose unbidden, each one sharper than the last. He stood suddenly pacing the room, his hands fidgeting at his sides. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, cruel in its indifference. Every second carried Elena further from the house, deeper into whatever secret she guarded. He thought of following her, imagined slipping into his truck, trailing her through quiet streets until the truth revealed itself. But the thought sickened him too. What if he discovered nothing? What if the truth was worse than he could imagine? His breath caught his chest tightening again, and he forced himself back into the chair before his legs gave out. He told himself he could not act rashly. He needed proof, not paranoia. Yet the storm inside him refused to calm. He gripped the armrest of the chair, nails digging into the leather until the tremor in his hands finally eased. Still the fear lingered, hidden under the surface like an undertow. His mind whispered possibilities, each darker than the last. What if Daniel was right? What if Elena was living two lives, one in his home and another half a world away? What if everything he thought he knew about her, about his family, was nothing but a carefully constructed lie? The thought hollowed him out. He pressed his fists against his eyes, blocking the light, but the darkness behind his lids only magnified the images his imagination conjured. Elena smiling across an airplane aisle, leaning toward a stranger. Elena adjusting her robe in the hallway, perfume curling around her like smoke. Two Elenas, both vivid, both impossible, tearing his sanity in two. He lowered his hands slowly, his breath shaky, and stared at the ceiling as though it might offer answers. He whispered his late wife's name so softly it barely left his lips. She would have known what to do. She would have cut through lies with a blade of truth, refusing to let doubt rot the family from the inside. He ached for her presence, for her certainty, for the strength she had carried in every word. Alone, he felt brittle, stretched thin. His own silence a prison that pressed tighter the longer it lasted. The sound of children playing drifted in from outside, faint but sharp enough to pierce the quiet. He rose and looked through the window, watched neighbors go about their lives untouched by the chaos searing his veins. He envied them their unbroken realities, their steady homes. He wanted to step outside, to breathe their air, to borrow their certainty. But he knew he couldn't escape the storm. Wherever he went, it would follow. His phone sat on the table screen, dark. He reached for it, thumb hovering over Daniel's number, desperate to hear his son's voice again, to confirm that what he had said hadn't been some mistake. But he pulled back, fear curling his fingers into a fist. What if calling again only made the nightmare more real? What if Daniel repeated the words that had already gutted him? He set the phone down, trembling, and leaned back in the chair. The storm raged quietly inside him, invisible but devastating. On the outside, he remained composed, silent. Still the father everyone expected, measured, rational, dependable. But beneath that mask, he drowned in doubt, every breath pulled deeper into waters too dark to escape. He knew silence could not hold forever. Something would break. And when it did, the truth waiting for him might be more terrifying than the contradictions tearing at him now. And then the sound of a car door outside snapped him upright. Tires crunched on gravel, a familiar rhythm of footsteps approached. Elena had returned. The father drew in a sharp breath, his hands curling tight against the table edge. He realized with sudden clarity that the next words she spoke, the next look in her eyes, could either drown him completely or give him the first thread of escape. He rose from the chair with stiff legs and drifted toward the wall, where the photographs hung in neat, deliberate rows. They had been there for years, each frame polished, each memory carefully preserved, a gallery of family milestones meant to anchor him through the storms of age. But now, as he stood before them, the faces stared back with a strangeness that hollowed his chest. What had once been proof of love and devotion now trembled under the weight of suspicion, every smile curdling, every captured joy darkened by a shadow he couldn't name. His eyes landed first on the wedding portrait. Richard stood tall in a tuxedo that never quite fit his shoulders. Elena beside him, radiant in her gown, her veil catching the sunlight as though heaven itself had blessed her. He remembered the moment clearly, the pride swelling in his chest, the relief that his son had found someone kind, someone who seemed devoted to building a life with him. But staring at it now, he saw only the sharpness of Elena's eyes, the way her smile stretched too wide, her fingers wrapped tightly around Richard's arm as though claiming more than just a husband. The joy he had once felt studying that photo now tasted bitter. Next to it was the photo of Michael's birth. The baby swaddled in blankets, his tiny fist raised like a declaration of life. Elena cradling him with maternal warmth. The father had cried that day, silent tears slipping down his cheeks as he looked at the continuation of their bloodline, the legacy carried forward. Yet now, as his gaze lingered on the frame, he questioned the softness in her eyes. Was it genuine? Or was it another performance, another layer of the mask she wore so effortlessly? The thought burned a betrayal retroactively staining one of the most sacred days of his life. He let his gaze fall lower to a more recent photo, Daniel grinning ear to ear in his crisp pilot's uniform, standing proudly beside the cockpit of his first plane. His son had mailed that photo home, a token of triumph, proof that dreams could be wrestled from the sky and made real. The father had hung it with trembling hands, his heart so swollen with pride it had nearly broken him. But even here doubt twisted the edges. Daniel's voice echoed in his mind, steady, urgent, warning him that Elena was not who she seemed. That photograph no longer glowed with triumph. It whispered betrayal, a reminder that even the purest dreams could be dragged into shadows when family turned treacherous. The father stepped back, his breath ragged, his eyes roaming across the entire wall. Dozens of frames, dozens of moments, birthdays, holidays, graduations. Smiles that once comforted him now felt like accusations. They mocked his blindness, laughed at his willingness to accept the surface without ever digging deeper. Each photo seemed to taunt him. You thought you knew us, but you never did. His throat tightened, his vision blurred, and for the first time in years he wanted to tear them down, to rip each image from the wall and shatter the glass until no memory remained to torment him. But he didn't. He couldn't. His hands hovered near the frames, trembling before retreating to his sides. To destroy them would be to admit the truth that everything he had built, every sacrifice, every ounce of love poured into this family had been for nothing. Instead, he let them hang silent witnesses to his unraveling, their glossy surfaces catching the dim light of the room. He turned away, but even with his back to them, he felt their eyes drilling into him, pressing the weight of memory against his spine. He moved to the mantel where another frame waited, a photograph of his late wife, her smile soft and knowing, her gaze steady and unshaken. He lifted it carefully, his fingers brushing over the glass, tracing the outline of her face. She was the one person he could trust beyond question, the one whose love had never faltered. He whispered her name, barely audible, as if speaking it aloud might summon her strength back into the room. For a moment the storm inside him eased, anchored by the thought of her voice, her certainty. But the relief was fleeting. The memory of her steadiness only highlighted the fragility of his present. The father set the frame down, his hands unsteady, and turned once more to the room around him. Every object was stained now, the couch where Elena had once laughed while watching television, the dining table where she had served meals with practiced grace, even the curtains she had insisted on buying, claiming they made the house feel brighter. He wondered if every choice she had made in this home was part of a performance, a careful arrangement to lull him into believing she belonged here. His stomach churned. He pressed a hand against it, willing the nausea to subside, but the sickness was deeper than his body. It lived in his mind in the way memory itself had become a weapon turned against him. He closed his eyes, but the images clung to the dark, refusing to leave. His wife's voice echoed faintly in his head, a reminder of how she had always warned him to be cautious, to look beneath the surface. He had ignored her wisdom in life. Now, in death, it haunted him. He opened his eyes again, staring into the dimming light filtering through the curtains. The air felt colder, though the thermostat hadn't changed. He wrapped his arms around himself, not for warmth, but for protection, as if bracing against a blow he knew was coming. The silence stretched oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of a car passing on the street. He glanced back at the wall of photographs one last time, and the faces blurred together into a collage of sorrow, betrayal, and doubt. In that moment he realized memory could no longer be trusted. Nostalgia, once his refuge, had turned poisonous. And as the shadows thickened around him, he understood that the past would not save him now. The answers he needed lay ahead in whatever truth Elena carried with her when she stepped back through the door. And when she did, he would have to decide whether to confront her or let the storm of suspicion consume him completely. He stood in the middle of the room, shadows stretching long across the floor, as the sun lowered itself into the Arizona horizon, and for the first time he spoke the truth aloud, if only to steady himself. He was 65 years old, a widower in Phoenix, Arizona, a man who had worked with his hands all his life and believed family was the one foundation that could not crack. He had poured everything into his two sons, Richard and Daniel, and into the woman who married into their lives, Elena, the daughter-in-law. He once swore he could trust as though she were his own blood. For years he had seen her as glue holding fractured edges together after his wife's death, a soft presence in a house that had grown too quiet. Now, standing beneath the watchful eyes of photographs that no longer offered comfort, he could not look at her without the taste of iron in his mouth. The phone call had changed everything. Daniel's voice, once a tether to pride and comfort, had cut through the fabric of normalcy like a blade. Since then, nothing about Elena felt right. Every gesture replayed itself in his memory with new meaning, every laugh a shade too hollow, every word weighed down by the possibility of deception. He remembered the way she always used her left hand to write shopping lists, even though he had once seen her sign a school form with her right. He remembered her sudden absences explained away with errands that left no receipts. He remembered her gaze at family gatherings too sharp, too measuring, as if she were cataloging rather than belonging. The details clawed at him relentless. He thought of the handwriting again, how the loops of her letters shifted depending on who was in the room. He thought of her moods, the way she could switch from warm and affectionate with Michael to cold and distant the moment the boy was gone. He thought of the strange phone calls she always took outside, her voice hushed but urgent words carried away by the wind before they could reach him. None of it had felt unusual in the moment. But now, stitched together under the shadow of Daniel's certainty, they formed a map of betrayal too intricate to ignore. He walked to the window and pulled the curtains aside, staring at the quiet street. Neighbors watered lawns, a dog barked in the distance. The ordinary rhythm of suburban life carried on without pause. He pressed his hand against the glass, the cool pain grounding him. Yet his reflection looking back was not a man at peace. His face was drawn, his eyes haunted a man caught between the life he thought he lived and the truth that was about to consume him. For years he had been the father who gave without question, who kept his head down and worked, who believed loyalty and sacrifice would shield him from betrayal. He had not remarried after his wife died. He had not pursued hobbies or travel or friendships beyond the bare minimum. His life had revolved around his sons, their futures, their families. He had thought this devotion would be enough to carry him through old age with dignity. But devotion had blinded him. Now he stood in the ruins of his certainty, questioning whether the people under his roof had ever truly seen him as anything more than a placeholder, a source of money, a name to manipulate. The dread thickened as he remembered Elena's eyes when she returned from the market earlier, the way they had lingered on him for a moment too long, searching, probing. He thought of Daniel's voice again, urgent, telling him she was on that flight. His son's certainty pressed down on him harder than his own doubt. There was no mistaking it. Daniel had seen her, had held her passport in his hand. That meant the woman who smiled in his kitchen, who asked about tomatoes, who smoothed her hair after a shower, might not be the woman she appeared to be. The contradiction carved into him deeper than fear. It felt like a warning that went beyond infidelity or lies. It felt like something larger, something darker, waiting to be uncovered. He turned away from the window and faced the photographs once more. His late wife's smile stared back at him unflinching, as though daring him not to look away. He whispered to her, telling her he was sorry for being blind, sorry for not seeing the crack sooner. He wished for her guidance, for her strength, but the only answer was silence. That silence pressed in, thick and suffocating, until he felt his chest constrict again. The clock ticked louder each second, a countdown to whatever truth Elena carried back with her through that door. He knew he couldn't stay still much longer. The clues were mounting, the weight unbearable. He would have to confront her, to peel back the mask, even if what lay underneath tore his world apart. His hand reached for the phone again, fingers brushing against Daniel's number, but he stopped short. If he called, Daniel would only confirm the nightmare. If he stayed silent, he might cling to the illusion a little longer. The choice clawed at him until he lowered the phone back to the table, his body trembling with indecision. The house was quiet again. Too quiet, every creak of wood and whisper of wind exaggerated, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. He sat down heavily, elbows on his knees, head bowed, trying to summon strength from the wreckage of certainty. He thought of Michael, innocent, unknowing, and felt the sting of shame. What kind of grandfather could not protect his family from a truth festering under their own roof? The silence fractured when a car rolled into the driveway. Headlights cut across the curtains, shadows darting across the walls. He straightened slowly, his pulse quickening. Elena was back. He could hear the muffled thud of her car door, the faint rustle of bags being lifted. Each sound was magnified, every detail loaded with menace. His hands clenched into fists, the tremor in them no longer from fear alone, but from the anticipation of what was about to be revealed. He told himself he was ready. He told himself this was the moment he would peel away the mask, that he would finally confront the truth instead of drowning in doubt. But as the key slid into the lock, his breath caught his chest tight, his heart slamming harder than ever. Because deep down he knew the next words out of her mouth, the next look in her eyes, might either unravel him completely or push him to take a step from which there would be no return. And for those watching, those who have followed his descent into doubt and terror, the question remains, what would you see if you were in his place? Comment where you're watching from, or even just leave a number, and don't forget to subscribe. Because what comes next will change everything. Life has a way of reminding us that trust should never be taken for granted, even within the walls of family. In this story, a father who built his world around his children and in-laws discovers that the ordinary can hide unsettling truths. For older audiences, the lesson is clear. While love and loyalty are powerful, they must be balanced with awareness and boundaries. Blind devotion can leave us vulnerable, and silence in the face of doubt can erode our peace of mind. It teaches us the importance of listening to our instincts, paying attention to the small details, and not dismissing signs that something may be wrong. More than that, it reminds us that protecting our dignity and clarity is just as vital as providing for others. As we grow older, wisdom is not only about what we've lived through, but also about how we choose to respond when our trust is tested. If this reflection resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us your city, your age, or even just a simple number. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that uncover the truths hidden in everyday life.